Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing a cinematic autopsy on literally one of the most expensive corporate tech disasters in modern history. I mean, just imagine sitting at a computer, hovering your finger over the keyboard, knowing that hitting one single key is going to wipe out a massive fortune. To really get the gravity of this, you kind of have to picture the sheer scale of Lidl. We're talking about a global juggernaut here. Thousands of stores, millions of daily customers, and a business model that is built entirely on razor-thin margins. Every single penny counts. And yet, we're going to break down exactly how one of the world's most ruthlessly efficient retail giants found themselves in this terrifying scenario where the absolute only winning move was to walk away from a monumental investment. So grab a seat because we are unpacking the wild story of Lidl's SAP failure. 500 million euros, $500 million. That is the staggering financial stake we're talking about today. It's the kind of money that could, build hospitals, fund massive infrastructure projects, or rocket a startup straight into the stratosphere. But let's actually put that into perspective for the grocery industry. Supermarkets operate on incredibly tight profit margins, usually around just 1% to 2%. So to make 500 million euros in pure profit, a grocery chain literally has to sell tens of billions of euros worth of milk, bread, and produce. It's a monumental mountain of commerce. But in this case, this incredible fortune was poured entirely into a brand new enterprise software system. And the shocking twist? It didn't yield a single cent in return. Let that sink in for a second. €500 million just vanished. Deleted. Yep. After years of work, thousands of hours of labor, and literally oceans of capital, the entire thing was simply scrapped. It wasn't repurposed. It wasn't sold off to someone else. It was completely wiped out. And when the news broke, it sent absolute shockwaves through both the tech and retail industries. Analysts were just stunned. Like, how does a globally successful, highly efficient grocery chain like Lidl just throw in the towel? Because remember, this wasn't some reckless startup. This was a calculated corporate giant. So to understand this massive failure, we've got to go back to the beginning, when the intentions were, actually quite brilliant.
Chapter 1. The Lidl Vision. Replacing the past.
Every great tech tragedy starts with a perfectly logical inciting incident. For Lidl, it was the dream of the Lidl vision. They weren't just throwing money around for fun. They were looking at the future of global retail and realized they desperately needed to replace their past if they wanted to survive. The origins of this massive project were deeply rooted in a very real, very pressing business need. See, at the time they launched this initiative, Lidl was running their massive, complex, international retail empire on an aging 30-year-old legacy system. And think about how fast technology moves. 30 years in the tech world is practically the Mesozoic era. A system that old is an absolute logistical nightmare for a modern supply chain. It creates these isolated silos of data where different departments literally cannot talk to each other. It severely lacks the real-time analytics you need to track inventory across thousands of international borders, and it just cannot scale to meet the demands of modern e-commerce. So the company desperately needed to modernize to keep up with competitors and usher in this sleek digital era. It was a completely sound strategy to upgrade, but as we're going to see, having a good reason to upgrade absolutely does not guarantee a successful execution.
Chapter 2. Standard versus custom. The immovable object meets the unstoppable force.
Okay, so this brings us to the core conflict that would eventually doom the entire enterprise. It's the classic battle in the IT world, standard versus custom. This is exactly where the immovable object of enterprise software meets the unstoppable force of a highly successful company's internal culture. Let's look at exactly where this project started to derail. Lidl had a really unique, highly successful way of valuing their inventory. They based it on purchase prices rather than retail prices. And this wasn't just some quirky accounting trick. It tied directly into their aggressive discount strategy and their incredibly efficient vendor negotiations. It was basically their secret sauce. SAP, on the other hand, relies on standard retail logic built around retail prices. The software was engineered from the ground up to do things the industry standard way. Attempting to reconcile these two totally opposing database architectures is a technical nightmare. It requires fundamentally rewriting how the software understands value, inventory, and cost at the absolute most basic foundational level. So you have these two systems, and they just violently clashed. Now, instead of adapting their internal processes to match the new software, which, by the way, is universally recommended when you're buying off-the-shelf enterprise solutions, Lidl's leadership took a much more stubborn approach. They were trying to bend the software instead of the business. They insisted on heavily customizing the SAP architecture to mimic their old, 30-year-old legacy processes. But here's the thing. Bending enterprise software at this massive scale requires armies of developers writing millions of lines of custom code. And every single time SAP released a standard update, those millions of lines of custom code would just break.
They were effectively building this fragile Frankenstein's monster of a system that became increasingly impossible to update, to manage, or honestly, even to comprehend. The more they customized, the more complex, buggy, and catastrophically expensive the whole system became.
Chapter 3: The Sunk Cost Trap, a 7-year slow-motion crash.
When you're forcing a square peg into a round hole, eventually something has to break. But incredibly, this wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-motion crash that dragged on for nearly a decade. Let's walk through this timeline together. Year 1 kicks off with just boundless optimism. The Lidl vision launches with massive fanfare, super aggressive timelines, and deep, deep corporate pockets. But as we move toward Year 4, the suffocating reality starts to set in. The delays are piling up. They're frantically attempting to bend the software, bringing in absolute legions of high-priced external consultants, and watching the budget just balloon completely out of control. Missed milestone after missed milestone creates this heavy atmosphere of dread. By years 5 and 6, you can only imagine the sinking morale, the boardroom fights, the frantic patches just to keep the dream alive, the endless cycle of throwing millions into a black hole just to fix bugs created by the last batch of custom code. And finally, Year 7, the death knell. After 7 agonizing years of throwing good money after bad, the entire project is completely scrapped. 7 years of monumental effort totally erased.
So you're probably wondering, why did incredibly smart, rational executives let it go on for 7 whole years? Well, it all comes down to the sunk cost fallacy. This isn't just a tech failure. It is a universal flaw in human psychology. It's that phenomenon where you're reluctant to abandon a terrible strategy purely because you've already invested so heavily in it. Think about waiting for a delayed flight, right? You've already waited 3 hours, so you decide, I'll wait another hour, even though driving would literally be faster now. You just don't want those first 3 hours to be wasted. The Lidl executives had already spent hundreds of millions of euros. To stop meant looking the board in the eye and admitting they had just wasted a fortune. So they kept going, hoping the next million or the next year would magically fix the unfixable. It's a psychological trap that captures absolutely the brightest minds in business. Chapter 4: Hitting the Delete Key, the 500 million euro decision.
But eventually, reality catches up with psychology. The system was just never going to work the way they wanted it to without fundamentally breaking the standard software architecture. It was finally time for a resolution, the decision to walk away. Just think about the sheer gravity of that moment for a second. Imagine the bravery, and let's be real, the absolute stomach-churning dread required for those executives to finally stand up and say, enough. To pull the plug on a project that cost €500 million requires an incredibly difficult realization that no matter how much you've spent, tomorrow is a new day, and you simply cannot keep funding a failure. And honestly, the most painful part? After pulling the plug, Lidl had to revert back to their 30-year-old dinosaur legacy system just to keep the stores running while they figured out a completely new plan. It was a brutally painful amputation for sure, but it was absolutely necessary to save the rest of the business from systemic failure. So, what does this all mean for us? There are 3 crucial lessons every chief information officer, project manager, and business leader needs to take away from this explainer. First, beware the clash of custom processes and standard software. Look, if you buy standard software, you need to be prepared to standardize your business. Trying to hard-code your past into the future is only going to build a very, very expensive prison. Second, you've got to recognize the sunk cost trap early. Do not let your past investments dictate your future decisions. If a project is failing, the money you spent yesterday is gone. The only thing that matters is the money you will spend tomorrow. And third, have the courage to know exactly when to walk away. Sometimes, stopping a project is literally the most profitable decision a leader can make before a €50 million mistake spirals into a €500 million catastrophe.
I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought. Look at your own projects, your own tools, your own daily workflows. Is your software serving your business, or is your business serving the software? Because if you find yourself endlessly bending and breaking your tools just to get your job done, you might be stepping onto the very same path that cost Lidl €500 million. Just keep that in mind the next time you kick off a major project. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer,